What an incredible day it will be when Israel do seek their Messiah and they do find the one they crucified, and they will find reconciliation in his presence. And Jeremiah is prophesying, as we said last time, in this shocking time when the people of Israel are about to be dragged off, and they're going to go to Riblah, and they're going to see the princes of Judah killed by Nebuchadnezzar and his troops. And in that day, they're going to feel the wrath of God upon that city. And just before that happens, this book of Consolation is provided, which gives a hope, not for the Babylonian captivity to return, but the final days when Christ will come and the nation will be reconciled. And that's in that very first verse that Brother Kevin read us tonight, when it says, all the families of Israel will be his people. And when you get to the very end of this prophecy, chapter 33 and verse 24, he speaks about two families, Ephraim and Judah. But when Christ comes, all the family will be united together. Or as Paul puts it in Romans 11:26, so all Israel shall be saved. What a day it's going to be. Now, the 4 chapters there, last time we looked at the return of the captivity of Israel and of Judah. Tonight we're going to start this section which culminates in the New Covenant. Then in the class, a couple of weeks, we're going to look at Jeremiah buying the field, Brother Jamie exhorted on. And finally, we're going to focus on the branch of righteousness who is coming. Now, as we said last time, if this is the scroll of consolation, we must look for Christ the Consoler. And he's here in the chapter before us. He's here in verse 10. He's the good shepherd who gathers the sheep together. And he's not going to lose any sheep from his fold ever again. He's there in verse 15 in the fulfillment of this prophecy in the times of the birth of Jesus. He's here in verse 22. Well, as some think, it's a prophecy of the virgin birth. But he's definitely there in verse 25 and 26. Who fills the weary soul? Who replenishes the one who is sorrowing? Well, it's the Lord Jesus Christ who fills the hungry and gives the troubled rest. And verse 26, it is Christ that will awake the dead saints and give them a new life, and their sleep will have been sweet unto them. And finally, end of the chapter, it's obviously Jesus Christ who provides forgiveness for the nation in the new covenant in verse 31 to 37. Now, last class we talked a lot about Jacob. And it's the return of Jacob which is the foundation of the promise here. If you just quickly flick back to Genesis chapter 31. We find here in Genesis 31, but it's not verse 28, it's verse 13. Genesis 31, verse 13. God says to Jacob, I am the power of Bethel, where thou anointest a pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. Return. There's our word, return. You must go back. And in chapter 32 and verse 9, Jacob at Penuel says, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, Yahweh, which said unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with it. So twice he talks about this instruction that he was to return. And we have Israel and Judah returning. And we had that key phrase in our last class, return the captivity. Return the captivity of Judah. Now, in the life of Jacob, I have summarized all the key references to Jacob in Genesis 30 and 31. Well, maybe I haven't got them all because it's quite a comprehensive list of incidents in the life of Jacob. Now, when Jacob returned, he didn't really return to a happy life. It was a troublesome return. And in the same sense, when Israel and Judah go back to the land under Jesus Christ, there'll be some great difficulties to face the nation. So the first one I have there is at Mizpah, he has a disagreement with Laban, and they make this agreement, and Laban builds a heap of stones and says, don't you come back over these stones for ill. Well, we have the same concept in the high heaps in 31 verse 21. But these heaps of stones now are guiding them the right way back to the land. Esau is coming. Jacob is distressed in chapter 32. And we saw that last time in Jeremiah 30 verse 10. Don't fear, don't be dismayed. But he was. He's struggling to meet Esau in Genesis 33. And tonight in our reading, it talked about the one that was stronger than he. And here's Jacob coming, and Esau's got 400 men. And in the future, Jacob's going to have to fight a formidable force against him. But Yahweh will be with him. In chapter 34 of Genesis, Jacob is frightened because his sons Simeon and Levi kill the men of Shechem. Oh, everyone's going to kill us now, he says. And we've got that same refrain, don't fear or be dismayed. He comes to Bethel in chapter 35, but it's not in peace. And similarly, the prophet talks about you will have trembling and dread and not peace. Rachel dies. In our reading tonight, we had Rachel weeping and finds a reward in her children. Jacob had to face with the rotten behaviour of his son Reuben with Bilhah. But Jacob came back and dwelt with tents. And last class we talked about he'd bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents. But we'll find tonight he finds security in the land. Joseph dies. And we'll talk tonight about the feeling that his son is not anymore. And he's weeping. All right, so there's many more, I think. Connections back. It's Jacob who's coming home. Okay, simple breakdown of tonight's chapter. And if you want to pencil this in, I'll give you a moment to do that. Verses 2 to 22 is about Ephraim. But Ephraim is doing something quite unusual. Ephraim is going to Zion. We're going to talk about why that's so unusual in a minute. Then verse 23 to 26, we've got a very short section about Judah, dwelling in Jerusalem in peace. And then the end of the chapter, we have the new covenant, and Israel and Judah have their sins forgiven. Now, we should note at this stage something which you probably know very well. Ephraim, of course, is the 10 tribes and represents prophetically the Jews around the world when Christ comes. The Jews of Australia, USA, Ukraine, wherever they are scattered are part of Ephraim. So the first 23 verses are about what's going to happen to Ephraim the 10 tribes around the world when the Lord Jesus Christ appears. And of course it will be Elijah who comes to take them home. Judah is what the prophets, which is of course the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, the prophets use for Jews in the land. But even they won't strictly be in the land when Christ appears, because they will be dragged off into captivity, as Zechariah 14, 1-3 says, possibly by Vladimir Putin and the Russians with their brutal aggression, who rip these people out of Jerusalem and take them and try and kill them all. But they're coming home. They're coming home in peace. And what do Ephraim and Judah both need? They need their sins forgiven. But that is the Abrahamic promise. And that's what the chapter ends with. The new covenant whereby their sins are forgiven. I got in trouble last time for going too quickly. So we finished with that? Oh, not that. All right, we can go on. Okay, so the chapter starts off, Jeremiah 31, with at the same time. Same time as what? The same time as the end of chapter 30, when God's judgments are going out into all the world. When there's a great whirlwind and a fierce anger. Why is God so angry? Because of the maltreatment of his people Israel. Remember? God gets angry because they say in chapter 30, verse 17, they say, well, Israel, the Jews, they're outcasts. God's cast them off. And as for Zion, nobody seeks for Zion anymore. So at this time, God will bring all the families. And I talked about chapter 33:24, 2 families, Ephraim and Judah, Jews scattered, Jews in the land. He'll get them all together. And that's the Romans 11 verse 26 quote. So all Israel shall be saved. God's plan is to get the whole nation and save them. And the end of verse 1 says, they shall be my people. That's exactly what we saw last time. Chapter 30, verse 22. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. And it's a theme tonight. Ephraim, the brat, the rebellious son, will be a dearly loved child, most delightful in his father's eyes. Now, verses 2 and 3, what changes Ephraim is love. Oh yes, the scourging by the European invading hordes and the punishment of the Jews will bring correction. We'll talk about that when we get down to verse 18. But the thing that brings the final transformation is love. And we're told in Zechariah 13 that they'll look at the wounds in Jesus' hands and they'll mourn for him and recognise what they have done. So, because it's God's grace, I've found 5 acts of grace in verses 1 to 5. You can tell me there's 4 or 6, but 5 seems a good number. The first one in verse 2, the people who are left of the sword, the remnant, found grace in the wilderness. So this concept, God's going to take a remnant. He's going to save a few. He's going to take them into the wilderness. Hosea 2:14. I'll bring them into the wilderness and plead with them there. Ezekiel 20, the second Exodus, verse 33 to 35. I'll take them out into the wilderness and purge out the rebels and reform this nation. Now, of course, these verses are based on Israel coming out of Egypt, right? they're saved from the wrath of Pharaoh. God delivers his people. But notice in verse 2, when they came out of Egypt, what did God give them? A law. What does he give them now? Grace. So his second act I've got up there is he extends his graciousness to them. Not in law and judgment, but in love. And Zechariah chapter 12, when it talks about their reformation, Zechariah 12:10 is on the screen. It talks about the spirit of graciousness, which will transform these hardened Jews, and they will accept that God has worked for them. And what will he do for them? Last bit of verse 2, top of the next page. I will cause him to rest. And I've noted down 2 Samuel 7:10. Yes, we know the promises to David, but one of the core parts to the promise to David is I will cause them to dwell in their own land and they will move no more. That's what Yahweh promised David. Right? Deuteronomy 28:65 talks about them wandering around the world. But Jeremiah says no more. The Jews won't be wandering from place to place. They will be settled in their own land. So Yahweh appeared of old to them in verse 3. Yeah, this of old, it can be a long time ago or it can be a long distance. Okay, same sort of expression is in chapter 30, verse 10. I will save you from afar, a long distance. I actually think it's probably a long distance here in verse 3. Yahweh appears to Israel from a long distance because he's calling them all the way back to Jerusalem. And they all have to go. You know, all the Jews of Australia, Josh Frydenberg and all the top 10 wealthy Jews in Sydney, they've all, Mr. Pratt, all these people, all got to go home. And God says to him, I've loved you with an everlasting love. Only occasion of that phrase in the whole Bible. An everlasting love. A love of the olam, a love of the age, an age-lasting love. He's going to talk, of course, chapter 31 at the end about an everlasting covenant in chapter 33. An everlasting love, a love for 1,000 years for his people. And his fifth act, in the end of verse 3, I will draw thee. Okay, circle in your margin the H, Hosea 11 verse 4, where God says, I have drawn you with the cords of love, right? And we could do quite a comparison between Hosea and Jeremiah, but we won't tonight. But he's picking up the same language of Hosea so many years before. If you turn to Romans 2 and verse 4, let me remind you of this fundamental principle upon which God works. Does he want to bring judgment, wrath, trouble on his people? No. Romans 2:4. Do you despise the riches of his goodness, his forbearance, and his long-suffering? Do you not know that the goodness of God leads thee to repentance? So it will be with Israel. It's his goodness, his chesed, that loyal love. He draws them to him and they will remain his people. Well, the result of Israel's reformation is absolute happiness. And it's described, this joy, in many different figures throughout this chapter. In verse 4, they're described as a young woman, the virgin of Israel. God says, you're a pure virgin to me. We'll forget about how evil and wicked you've been. I'll just consider you a pure virgin. And what are you going to do in verse 4? You're going to be adorned with tabrets They put these tabrets on to make a joyful sound. And they go forth in the dances of them that make merry. It's absolute joy when Ephraim goes home. And you can find many other cases, or not that many cases really, when the virgin daughter of Zion rejoices. And the cases there, Exodus 15:20, we have Miriam leading all the women in exuberant dancing at Yahweh's salvation at the Red Sea. And in Judges 11:24, we have the dancing of the women in the days of Jephthah. So there's music and dancing because Ephraim has redeemed. Now God has a positive work to do with this people. And it's reflected in this phrase at the start of verse 4, I will build thee and thou shalt be built. We talk about building up the body of Christ. We talk about building as a positive thing that God intends to do in the earth. Now, the idea of building comes up many times in Jeremiah. Now, it often comes with building and planting. We'll go into that in a moment. You build a house and you plant a vineyard. This is a stable environment. It's used in the Psalms, isn't it? That you have a house and the olive plants grow up the side and the vineyard. However, it's also used for building idols. It's also used, the bottom left, for Jehoiakim building in a plush palace. And at the end of the prophecy, Nebuchadnezzar is building ramparts and siege engines to destroy their city. That's not the sort of building they really wanted. So building and planting. You're home and you're not shifting ever again. And Jacob doesn't have to live in tents. He's going to build a house. Did Jacob ever live in a house? I don't think so. He dwelt in tents. He was a stranger and sojourner. But now he's building and he's going to plant. Now, do you want to do a little colouring exercise? You've got a coloured pencil. Do you want to do the word build? The word build, can you read that? Okay, the word build starts back in chapter 29, verse 5. Build ye houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. But where were they going to build houses? What's the prophet telling them? Babylon. In Babylon. Did anyone want to build a house in Babylon? Did they want to hear that? Settle down in Babylon, build a house and plant gardens? It's repeated in verse 28. Therefore he sent unto us in Babylon, saying, this captivity is long. Build ye houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. So in chapter 29, the building and planting is in Babylon. Okay, now in chapter 35, after the scroll of Consolation, we have the Rechabites. And what do? They do no building and planting. They're strangers and sojourners. So, chapter 35, verse 7, Jonadab, our father, you can ring this word build again, told us not to build houses, nor sow seed, nor plant vineyard. Okay? Don't do it. Don't live in a house. Don't have a vineyard. Don't build and plant. Same words in verse 9. We will not build houses for us to dwell in, neither have we vineyard, nor field, nor sea, but we have dwelt in tents. So before the book of Consolation, they've got to build and plant in Babylon. And after the book of Consolation, we've got the Rechabites, who don't build or plant at all. But in this book of Consolation, we've got building and planting. All right, ready to note these down? Chapter 30, verse 18, we considered last time. I will bring Jacob's tents and have mercy on his dwelling place, and the city shall be builded. Got the word? Builded. The city of Jerusalem shall be built upon our own heap. In the Hebrew, it's a tel. We know what a tel is. It's one of those big piles of ruins. It's going to be builded. Chapter 31, verse 4. I will build thee, and thou shalt be built. 31, verse 4. And the planting bit is in verse 5. Thou shalt plant vines upon the mountains of Samaria. The planters shall plant and eat them as common things. So verse 4 is about building, and verse 5 is about planting. Got that? Am I going too fast tonight? Okay, verse 28. It's towards the end of our reading tonight. I will watch over them to build and to plant. Right? You're coming back. I used to destroy everything. God, I used to destroy you, but now I'm going to build and plant. Um, 32 verse 31. This city has been a provocation from the day that they built it. Jerusalem was built long ago. Now it's a city of trouble. And the last reference we need is chapter 33, verse 7. I'll cause the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Israel to return, and will build them, 33 verse 7, as at the first. Okay, so this concept of building is central to God's plan. You remember last time I talked about the 4th year of Jehoiakim as the book ends. And the book of the covenant is right in the middle, chapter 30 to 33. And the previous chapters were about lies, and the last chapters were about keeping the covenant. You see a similar sort of theme with building. The chapters before the book of the covenant are about building and planting in Babylon. The chapters afterwards are about no building and planting, but in the book of Consolation, it's about building and planting in Zion. They're coming home, they're going to build houses, and they're going to plant vineyards. Okay, we'll skip over all the building and planting ideas in the Bible and leave that to another day. Now, God says in chapter 31 that they are going to plant a vineyard. That's not a bad picture, with Tabor in the background and beautiful vineyards. And where are they going to plant these vineyards? On the mountains of Samaria. Verse 5. Well, that's very good. They're going to plant vineyards. But what happened in the past? Yahweh planted a vineyard, but it got broken down, didn't it? Yeah? And became unfruitful. So the beautiful vineyard of Isaiah 5 got smashed. In the future, the vineyard will be maintained and be beautiful and fruitful. The other thing that happened to Yahweh's vineyard is they got all the grapes and made lots of wine, and they became drunkards. And it was Ephraim that drank too much wine from the vineyard. So, Yahweh's people are like a beautiful vineyard that bring forth wine for him. Now this idea of, end of verse 5, shall eat them as common things. Under the law, you couldn't eat the fruit for the first 5 years. In the 4th year of a vineyard, you give it to Yahweh. And the 5th year, it became common, right? So when it says you shall eat them as common things, the margin says profane them. In other words, anybody could eat them. So they're going to have the vineyards for 5 years. Or, by extension, they would live there forever, enjoying the fruits thereof. So they're coming back, building houses and planting vineyards. And what will they do when they get home? Well, verse 6 says there will be a watchman. Brother Jamie told us about the watchman in our last class last year from Ezekiel 33. There's a watchman, and he's telling everyone a message. And what's his message? End of verse 6. Let's go to Zion, unto Yahweh our God. Let us go up to the Lord Jesus Christ to Zion. Well, you know, this was really weird behaviour for Ephraim. You know, you call Ephraim an anti-Zionist. He didn't like Zion. The most famous Ephraimite was a man called Jeroboam, and he built calves at Dan and Bethel and said to the people, do not go to Zion. Don't go there. Keep out of the place. You stay here in the northern kingdom. But now the voice is going, let us go to Zion. You can note down this passage, 2 Chronicles 30, verse 10 and 11. Because in the days of Hezekiah, he invited all the people from Ephraim to come to Zion to the Passover. And they said, come to the Passover in Jerusalem? We're not doing that. Some of the people of Manasseh and other tribes came down, but not the Ephraimites. They were not interested in Zion. What was Ephraim's problem that God has to fix? Well, it's twice stated in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 13. Ephraim will no longer envy Judah. Ephraim envied Judah. The 10 tribes envied Judah and Benjamin with their capital in Jerusalem. Twice it's stated in Isaiah 11 verse 13, and Judah would no longer vex or annoy Ephraim. You see, Ephraim had an ego problem, and I think their problem came in Genesis 48. Here's Ephraim, the son of Joseph, Jacob's favoured wife, Rachel. Right? Rachel's son Joseph is before Jacob, and here's his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And what does Jacob do? He crosses his hands and puts his right hand on the head of Ephraim. And from that point on, Ephraim thought he was the ant's pets. You know, our grandfather put his right hand on my head and gave me a special blessing. You know what they couldn't cope with? In the very next chapter, Genesis 49, Jacob prophesied, the scepter will not depart from Judah. Judah will be the king. And he couldn't cope with that at all. You might note down 1 Chronicles 5, verses 1 to 3. Okay? And Ephraim could not cope with the fact that the kingship was in Judah. And so from then on, he never accepted it. And Ephraim was a very diminished tribe. I won't go into this, but in the towns of the inheritance that Joshua handed out, Judah got 123 villages and Ephraim got 11. In the genealogies of Chronicles, Judah gets 3 chapters and Ephraim gets 8 verses. Yeah? And in those genealogies, the genealogy of Judah go right through past the Babylonian captivity to Zerubbabel's grandsons. The genealogy of Ephraim finishes with Joshua, who was born in Egypt. You know, Ephraim was the lesser. But in this day, verse 6, all over. We're not envying Judah anymore. Let's go and worship in Zion. So they're coming home. Verses 7 to 9. They're shouting for joy. They're shouting among the chief of the nations, a name for the nation of Israel itself. They're publishing it. Let it be heard, as you could render the Hebrew. Let it be heard. And what's going to be heard? Oh, Yahweh, you have saved your people. I think it should be past tense. Yahweh, you have saved your people. Look at us. The Russians came in, wiped us out, dragged us off into captivity. Horrendous persecution we've been through, but now, Yahweh, you have saved your people, the remnant of Israel. Just a few left. You read Zechariah 13, verse 9. Zechariah 14, 1 to 3. Yes, there'll be hardly any left after the Russians have invaded the land. Just bring up the people in Ukraine and warn them about what the Russians are like if they need any warning. The brutality that Judah and Ephraim will receive will be awful. But now they're going to be saved. And so God is going to bring them in verse 8 from the north country, right? How many passages talk about the north country? Say to the north, give up, Isaiah 43:6. Isaiah 49, verse 12, these come from the north. Jeremiah 3, backsliding Israel comes home from the north. Jeremiah 13, the beautiful flock. You don't need all these references. And Jeremiah 23, verse 8, the second exodus. They come from the north. And who's coming? Verse 8, the blind and the lame. Where do you read that? Isaiah 35. The blind will have their eyes open. The lame will be able to walk. In fact, I think there's a whole section here. If you look down your margin, you'll see multiple references to Isaiah 35. And it seems that Jeremiah is picking up the very thoughts of Isaiah 35. There'll be songs and joy in verse 7, shouting for gladness. The blind and the lame will come home. There'll be a great company who will return. The ransom, the remnant are coming home. They'll walk, verse 9, in a way, a straight way, called in Isaiah 35, a way of holiness. They'll find water. There's water in verse 9, rivers of waters in Jeremiah 31. There's waters in verse 12. They'll be like a watered garden. There's waters in verse 14. The word satiate means to provide with water. And the same thing happens in Isaiah 35. There'll be pools of water. God will provide spiritual water for his people Israel. And in verse 11 we read here, Yahweh hath redeemed Jacob and ransomed him. Well, who returns in Isaiah 35? The redeemer of Yahweh shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. And the previous verse of Isaiah 35 talks about the ransomed. And they'll sing. Verse 12 here talks about they'll sing in the height of Zion for all the blessings that Yahweh provides. And in the midst will be the great shepherd of verse 10. And he calls upon the nations in verse 10 to witness, and all the world will stand in awe. The nations will see that God, who has scattered his people, gathers him and guards them as a shepherd doth his flock. Every single lamb will be accounted for, because God has saved his people from him that was stronger than he. And so they'll find these blessings. In verse 12, the blessings, the wheat and the wine and the oil. This expression commonly in the Bible, the corn, the wine and the oil. It's the bread and the wine, brothers and sisters, young people. It's the meal and drink offering. The abundance of God's spiritual blessings to his people. The young of the flock and of the herd. The sheep and the cows. And those 5 blessings of God are spoken of many times in the book of Deuteronomy. The blessings I will pour out. The corn, the wine, the oil, the sheep and the cattle. These are the blessings of God. And the problem is, says God, I'll bless you with all these things and you don't appreciate them. Well, in the future, they will appreciate them. For in the end of verse 12, they'll be happy. They will sorrow not at all. Their mourning's gone. For in verse 13, they've been comforted. Here's Jesus Christ. I am the comforter. He will make them rejoice from their sorrow. And they will see this spiritual fatness. Verse 14. The priests will find plenty of fat to be offered on Yahweh's altar as he pours out these good things. But then it changes a bit in verses 15 to 22, and we have some reflection on their past sadness. Now, let's just get this place, Ramah. Thanks to Brother Dan Hill for a couple of points. Obviously, it was the birthplace of Samuel, and it was the place where the kingdom was formed. Ramah, when they came to Samuel and said, give us a king. But it was also the place where the kingdom finished. Just slip across to Jeremiah chapter 40. What happened at Ramah? What was this crying that Jeremiah was prophesying about? Jeremiah 40 verse 1, the word that came to Jeremiah from Yahweh after that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had let him go from Ramah, when he had taken him being bound in chains among all that were carried away captive of Jerusalem and Judah, which were carried away captive unto Babylon. Terrible things at Ramah. The nation started there, 1 Samuel 8. The nation would finish here with the Babylonians dragging Judah off into captivity. And later, Jeremiah was to pen an awful lamentation, chapter 1 of his book, about the tragedy of the nation being dragged off from Ramah. But the prophet describes in verse 15 that there would be bitter weeping and Rachel would weep for her children. So tell me, where is this Rachel described as in bitter weeping? Bitter weeping in Genesis. Where does Rachel cry? That's what we think, but it doesn't mention any crying at all. In fact, I'm not sure that a woman going through excruciating childbirth actually cries. They might scream or groan, but I don't think crying is that obvious. I want to be careful about talking about childbirth. I heard an anonymous brother talking about childbirth recently on Coast FM, and Tim Colliver had to put him straight. I hope his wife put him straight when he got home. He obviously had forgotten what childbirth was about, but it doesn't mention, because she actually dies. So You know, it's a tragic story, but I don't think she cries. And Jacob doesn't cry either in that story. Any other types? Right, it doesn't mention she cries, but I think you're right. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 30. I think this is right. Brother Michael Ashton put me onto this, but, you know, I've sort of been thinking about this all day. What's her problem? Anytime we had a voice and crying is actually when Jacob meets Rachel. But in chapter 30, verse 6, here's the voice of Rachel. And she said, God hath judged me, has heard my voice. Now, Rachel back in verse 1 is very bitter. She envies her sister. She is upset because her children are not. She doesn't have any children. Rachel's weeping because she has no children. And in fact, in verse 8, she talks about her sister with great wrestling. Can I prove that she was crying? No, but I think it fits the context pretty well. She's in bitterness, but her bitterness stops because of two reasons. Back in verse 18, Leah is given the company of Jacob for a night. And she says, God hath given me my hire because I've given my maiden to my husband. She called his name Issachar, my reward. Now that's the same word used in Jeremiah 31:16. Your work shall be rewarded. Leah got a reward. She got a son called Issachar. And when Rachel turns to God, her crying stops. And she gets a son called Joseph. Verse 24. God gives me another son. Now, I think this story has another application in the life of Jacob, but I don't have time to tell you about it tonight. Maybe another day. By the way, what's Matthew chapter 2 about? Rachel weeping for her children. Well, Brother Thomas says, don't try and impose Matthew 2 explanation on Jeremiah 31. It's not a complete fulfillment. John Thomas says it only says it was a saying of Jeremiah, right? And Matthew's making an extension of another day when Rachel has lost her children. Okay, I just tell you this to whet your appetite. When it says that she refuses to be comforted, the only time that's ever used in the Bible is of Jacob, Rachel's husband, refusing to be comforted because his children are not. So happened many times in their history. They would lose their children. And in the future, the children will be lost again. And Yahweh will bring them home. Well, what about this son called Ephraim? How bad is he? Well, back in Jeremiah chapter 31. God says to Rachel in verse 16, stop crying, right? Stop crying, I will give you children. Your work, your motherly task of having children will give you a reward. And then he says in verse 16, they shall come again. Come again. From the land. Right? And then you notice the next verse, they will come again to. So all the Jews are going to leave all the countries of the world, come again from those countries. And they're going to come again to their own border. Why? Because in verse 17 there's a hope, there's a tikvah, there's something that Yahweh has on offer for his people. What about Ephraim? Well, in verse 18 and 19, Ephraim speaks. And he says to God, I feel awful. I was chastised. You chastised me, God, and I was chastised. Now, this word chastised was translated back in chapter 30 and verse 11, I will correct you. God's corrected me. In the prophecy of Moses, I'd like to take you here, Leviticus 26. The word is translated to punish, to reform, and chastise. And Ephraim saying, God, you said you'd correct me. I've been corrected. I was like a bullock, a wild steer. And God, you put the yoke on me and tied me down and tamed me. God, in the end of verse 18, turn me around, return me to you, and I'll be turned. You are Yahweh. You can change my heart. And he says in verse 19, when I turned, I repented. When I was instructed, when I came to know you, God, when I really came to know you, God, I spoke upon my thigh. And in your margin, you have Ezekiel 21 verse 12. You know, when people feel remorse, I don't know what you do these days. In those days, they go bang and hit themselves on the thigh, right, to show how sorry they were. So I came to know you, God, and I felt this terrible weight of my sins. I was ashamed. I felt all the disgrace of my childhood. And Yahweh says in verse 20 to 22, that's okay, Ephraim. Ephraim, verse 20, you're my dear son. Let's forget about how rebellious and disobedient you've been. You're my dear son. You're my delightful child. Yes, I spoke to you quite severely, says God, like a good parent. But you earnestly remember. In the Hebrew, you remember. It's one of those Hebrew words that's repeated. You remember. Okay, I remember you, says God. And my bowels are troubled. My intestines rumble. You know, the margin says shout. You know when you're really emotionally stirred up, and maybe the person sitting next to you can hear your stomach rumbling because you're in an emotional state. And Yahweh says, I'm emotionally stirred up for you, Ephraim. Right? I really feel for you. Young people might appreciate going for an exam or a driving test and feel really nervous. Your stomach rumbles. And God says, I will surely have mercy. Again, in the Hebrew, repeated word. Compassion, compassion. I'm really going to show my love to you, Ephraim. So he says, Ephraim, come home. All's forgiven. We'll start afresh. Find your way home. Verse 21 and 22. Find your way home. Set up the waymarks. The word waymark is a signpost. Set up the signposts. Except they didn't have wooden ones back in those days. They had stones. This word signpost is only ever used for a sign on a grave. But here it's a sign on a road. This way to Zion. Set up a heap. A pile of stones in a can and mark the way you're going to come. Please come home. And Jerusalem Bible, Lane Rittmeyer always said, grab the sense of it. Not very exact, but grabs the sense. Come home, Virgin of Israel. Come home to these towns of yours. How long do you hesitate, disloyal daughter? For Yahweh is creating something new on the earth. The woman, Israel, sets out to find her husband, Yahweh, again. Yeah, in the Hebrew, this word man is a giba, a mighty man. Yahweh is a mighty man, and she will find her comfort in him. Notice how many times we had the woman in this chapter. The woman, verse 4, the virgin daughter of Israel. Verse 8, the woman with child. Verse 13, the virgin rejoicing. Verse 15, Rachel crying once her children are received. Verse 21, the virgin daughter of Israel. Verse 22, turn aside my daughter. Now, some people think verse 22, a woman shall compass a man, is actually a prophecy of the virgin birth. Brother Walker, who wrote the book on Jeremiah, was quite adamant about it. I don't think so. From my best understanding of the Hebrew, it's the woman who encircles the man and seeks him to be her husband in a new relationship. Okay. Well, I think we need to stop there. And again, it's been a little bit of a hurried tour. But the power of the record is Ephraim, these hard-hearted Jews from all around the world, are going to be drawn by the Lord Jesus Christ and by Elijah back to their homeland. They're going to come to Jerusalem, a city they've never been to before, and they're going to rejoice in the restoration to be Yahweh's people.